Good morning, beautiful people of the internet, and welcome to another super special Sunday supplement with all the legends. Everyone's here. It's been a while since we've been a full complement. We've got Mr. Ross Harper, Mr. Adam Lawrence, Lady Helena of Malta. That's an official title. I read that somewhere. Mr. Piotr Rusnek, and myself, of course, Jay Howard. We were all pretty much blown away by Mr. Lawrence's weekly supplement, and if you're not following that on Facebook or LinkedIn, you should be. It's just as simple as finding his profile, adding him as a friend, and reading the entire back catalogue, which is speckled and spattered with value and an opportunity that perhaps other people haven't seen yet. But I think we're starting today with just a couple of phrases and sayings. The first one of which is the devil is in the detail. I think I'll let Mr. Lawrence take over from here, since it's his article. But if you haven't read it, you now have the next 3.5 hours whilst Adam gives his discourse to read it for yourself. Take it away, Adam.
It was a reasonable effort today. I noticed I was getting near the 5,000 word mark and thought maybe I should just rein it in a little bit. There was lots and lots more that I wanted to say, actually, because it is one of those weeks where I think arguably I've been banging on about a load of tripe for 43 years, but certainly for the last sort of 12 months plus, I've been going on about inflation quite a lot and some of the choices that the central bank is facing. I know we're getting bad feedback, aren't we? Don't think that's at my end. How's that? Sounds a bit better, maybe.
Yeah.
So one of those core points has been inflation, and then since probably October, November last year, it's been self-evident that what I was saying was going to come to pass. And then one of the other things I've been saying for a couple of years, which has been around fragility in times of fragility, or where your baseline is, has also come to pass with what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment. So those things come together. I take no pleasure in being right at these things, obviously. A little bit of pleasure, if I'm honest, but not great pleasure. And we've moved forward to a point where to be either in charge of the Treasury or a major player at the Treasury, or to be involved in a senior level at the central bank, is not a lot of fun at all, and a really, really, really tough gig at the moment. If you imagine what Andrew Bailey, the governor's job description, looks like, he's probably got as one of his KPIs, keep inflation within a reasonable range. So he's probably looking for another job right now, I'd imagine, if he's realizing what's going on. And the other problem is that the bank is fairly limited in what it can actually do. In many ways, a lot of its role is to calm markets, businesses, people and consumers down, keep them rational, keep their feet on the ground, avoid them from panicking. And if you look at the skill with which they've navigated some of the past, let's limit this to the last 6 or 7 years, the morning after the referendum was a notable one where they had utter clarity and brought an immediate calm to the markets when no one else could. And another one of those times was when the pandemic first hit and they juiced the interest rate back down and then back down again, and made clear that they would smooth the waters, and then had a very, very sensible conversation about negative interest rates, something which the Eurozone have used and found it to be a difficult trap to get out of, something that a number of other countries have used, and the jury's out as whether they've worked or not. Very sensible conversation about that, which was going on even 12 months ago. Bizarrely, if we look back, it was around February 2021 when that was really rearing its head. So we really look to the central bank quite often for guidance. And if you look at for guidance at the moment, you're not really finding any. What you're finding is a central bank that doesn't want to say, look, we can't really control this inflation by putting rates up, but we don't really have anything else we can do, so we're going to put rates up. You could argue,
that'd be lovely, refreshingly honest if they actually just said that.
Oh, wouldn't it just? And one of the points that I made today was, going back to 75 bips, which we've done this week for anybody who's not seen it. It's not the biggest play in the world. I mean, we've been at 75 bips. That's the maximum interest rate, base rate level we've been at for the last 13 years. At this point, 13 years ago that the MPC put the rate down to 0.5, and we've had a bit of a flirt around 0.75, and we've had a couple of knocks. We would have gone a bit higher if it hadn't been for the referendum, no doubt. Whether we would have sustained that, I don't think it matters, because we still would have been at 0.1 when the pandemic came. There's no way, no two ways about it. We did what we did. We went to 0.1 because we didn't want to go to 0. That's how we dealt with it. So 0.75 doesn't take us to a place we haven't been to in the past, 6 or 7 years. Nothing particularly concerning. There are a number of issues, because when you try and model this stuff, you are reliant on things like unemployment, things like GDP growth. And one of the big problems is you're taking growth from a weak base. So if you look at the last 12 months, GDP growth looks healthy because it went down so much because of the pandemic. So then you've got a problem, because and you see this all the time with graphs that people share on social media. Okay, so we don't have to do year on year, right? So should we do 2 years? Should we do 2.5 years? Should we do 3 years? Should we cherry pick the start point, which is what so many people do in order to try and make a point? Now, if all your models are based on annualization and the pace of change of data, and the pace of change has been screwed by volatility, it leaves you basically somewhere between the devil and the deep blue sea, ultimately, because it's a little bit of finger in the air stuff, and it's a little bit of quantitative modeling. And what the bank would really, really like to say at the moment is, look, Rishi, there's not a lot we can do, right? So we've kind of decided we're going to unwind this quantitative easing situation, because we all accept, we've all had time, and I think there's not really any publicity around this stuff. So this is pure speculation from me. But I think one of the things that there's been time for over the last 2 years is reflection, generally speaking. So a lot of people have reflected. Some of them have left the labour market earlier than they would have done. A lot of businesses have reflected. And at the governmental level, they'll also have reflected. And what they'll have reflected on is, ultimately, you look back at the last crisis when you're dealing with the current one to see what to do to an extent, and what went well and what didn't. And generally speaking, monetary policy wasn't great because it was too slow. And fiscal policy was really, really poor. Austerity destroyed a lot of value. Those are not really opinion pieces. There's a fairly significant weight of evidence behind those two statements. So they look back, and they did change things. They did move much more quickly when the pandemic came. But they will have looked back, I'm sure, and thought, well, you know what? When we introduced QE, we did say it was going to be temporary. And by anyone's definition of temporary, 13 years in, it's not all that temporary. And in fact, when you look at it, it's not only been temporary, it's cranked up 5 times since it was introduced, from a mere couple of 100 billion up to nearly 1 trillion. So it's gone up in little steps as we've needed it. So it's kind of more morphine in the drip. And at what point do you either kill the patient or get the patient off the morphine drip? Now, I agree with the broad sentiment of that. What I don't agree with is that this year is the year to try and fix all these problems at once, because we've got more problems to deal with than we've had, for many years. And that includes 2020, really, because the temporary measures put in when there's widespread support, 90% of the country probably supported turning the taps on in 2020. That's not normally what happens. You've got a reasonable right-wing contingent of the Conservative Party that say, look, stop spending money on stuff. Don't do that. Cut the NHS budget, cut the education budget. They were all relatively quiet, especially on the NHS front, because everybody's busy fearing for their lives apart from anything else. So they've now gone forward to this situation where you've got these multiple things still working away in the economy. You've got too much money out there. How do you withdraw that money? You've got a stock market that isn't as buoyant as, say, the US because of Brexit, apart from anything else, but it's probably still at the higher end of where most people would value things at the moment. And you forget that in inflationary environments, there aren't really many bits of good news for most things. And even gold, even that great store of that flight to gold that happens when you're in times of inflation. Gold had a pretty significant bull run. I think it was like early 18 to about the middle of 19, which meant when all this came in 2020, what did people say straight away? They said, pandemic, gold, charge. But you're not looking at where gold started from. So then people started to explain it by saying, well, it's crypto. You see, everyone goes to crypto now. Well, if you look at the market capitalization of crypto, you would know that not to be true because it simply didn't absorb enough of the action. I'm not saying it was no factor, but it definitely wasn't suddenly a proxy for gold. It's just that gold was already quite expensive. So you can then get yourself into a bit of a brain fog, which is what I'm trying to avoid this. I'm trying to give people as much information as possible without worrying them too much. But you can get yourself into a bit of a brain fog of what the hell are you supposed to do? And I think probably the best placed person to talk about what you are supposed to do in these situations is someone who has managed to make money throughout multiple business cycles. And he is just on my screen to my bottom left, Mr. Ross Harper. So I'm gonna throw it over to you, Ross, if that's okay, because the point really is you can make money in any environment, can't you?
Yeah, but I think what you're addressing are all the pillars behind what may or may not happen. And the big difficulty, I think, for people just now is, me included, is trying to work out what things are you doing right that you've done right historically, what things are you doing right that are going to work over the short term, and what things are you doing right that are going to work over the medium and long term. And I think that's the hardest part just now. I've been involved in conversations with various people over various different WhatsApp groups and chats and Facebook chats. Quite a lot of us are in all these different groups, and you see people asking the same question, which is really, what do we do now? And at the moment, I can't see people making, unless they've got a specific reason to come out of things. Most of the groups I'm in are property groups. There's a couple of now crypto groups, and they're just, wahoo, the world's amazing. Doesn't matter whether it goes up or down, we're going to be billionaires, which I find quite amusing. Because it may or may not work, and each of them independently, some might make quite a lot of money and some might not. You've got but there's no way of working out what that is. And one guy I know lost 350 million quid about 3 weeks ago, and I'm like, geez, oh, and he said, oh, don't worry, it'll come back. These coins are going to be worth a fortune. I'm just, right, okay. And so it's so nobody really knows with that type of stuff where it's going. With property, it's almost impossible. 18 months ago, it was woe betide us, it's going to be horrific, the market's going to collapse, or yippee, the market's going to collapse, we can start to buy things at volume again. But it hasn't really happened that way. Supply's been limited. People have been looking for other kind of things to do other than move house. So lots of the older people have stayed put because they're worried. So the dynamics of this compared to, well, when I graduated, I came out in 93 and qualified as a surveyor. There were no jobs in surveying, which is how I became an estate agent. That side of things was tough because I didn't get to do what I thought I was going to do through university. That actually worked out for the best. 2000, it was the same, 98, 99, 2000. I kept thinking we were going to have a crash. Could prices get any higher than they already were? They were definitely going to crash, and sat in my hands and didn't do huge amounts of things. And then the market just kept on growing. It kind of slowed off a wee bit and then picked up again. 2008, I was blindsided completely. So in reality, I wouldn't wish my 2008, 2009, 2010 on anybody at all. Just the reality of it was, for 2 years, I didn't know what to do. So it's great when you look back from now to 12 years ago and 13 years ago, and what you're saying is right, Adam. Yeah, I've done various different things. I've kind of dug myself out of various holes, I think, is the honest way of doing it. But it's predicting what's going to do or what's going to happen is almost impossible. We're looking at stuff within our own portfolios as to whether you hold, whether you sell, and there's obviously discussions around. Nobody's actually got an answer, and I'm the thickest person in the triumvirate and one of them. So I'm going to be listening to the arguments with the other two bright people, and trying to work out, right, is that really the right thing to do? Legitimately, should we be doing anything? So I think we'll see a lot of people sitting on their hands. The only thing I would suggest probably just now is not the time to rearrange everything and start afresh, start something new. I've been sitting on my hands for the last wee while. We've not been buying as much stock. The auctions don't have as much stock in them. The estate agents not have as much stock in it. And I think everybody's quite worried, and I've just kind of taken the view, well, if it comes back, it comes back. But there's no point in doing anything about it just now. Let's just buy what we can, turn what we can, make what money we can just now, and sit and hold on. Whilst hopefully trying to get to a position where you can buy buy-to-lets. My other businesses are all growing kind of steadily. They're not going great. But at the moment, I've been looking at, because I'm bored. I'm the kind of person that doesn't take well to sitting in my hands. And even at that, I've looked at a couple of businesses to buy this week, which both make perfect financial sense. They can be bought for reasonable money. And then I'm just like, why take the risk just now? If you don't need to do it right now, why don't you sit and wait? And you might not be one of the people who buys at the ultimate top or the ultimate bottom, but at least you might have a guideline of where the market's going to go, whether it's the financial markets, the property markets, and also what the outcome of the Ukrainian situation. I don't understand it. We sit and watch all this horrific footage night after night after night, but there are obviously other parts of the world that are involved in these types of conflicts as well that you don't see as much in television. I do think the kind of China situation with Taiwan is going to become a major issue just now. So the reality of even if Ukraine gets sorted, we've then got an issue with, are the Russians going to trust the property market in the UK ever again, having maybe lost some things? And you're hearing of repossessions all around Europe of boats, fancy yachts, and it all sounds amazing, thinking, oh, it doesn't affect me because it's Russian billionaires. But then the money those people spend when they're buying their Princess yacht, the Princess Yacht Company's probably got 20 orders from Russian billionaires just now that have all been put on hold or they're not able to deal with. So that means that the guys who make the yachts and build the yachts and polish the yachts and whatever a yachts guy does, but those people might not have jobs going forward, or they might be getting laid off. So, and some of these guys control big businesses, and they control big businesses that are part of the UK economy. So for me, it's sitting in your hands just now. If you see really good opportunities that you can get in and out of in the short term, that's probably the right thing to be doing. But I don't have any clarity at all, and I've just been honest that you sit and read your supplement and it's analysing points absolutely beautifully. And the thing you do, Adam, I think, unlike most people I've ever listened to, is you do it in a way that everybody understands. So nobody comes back after listening to you talk about things and says, oh, he talks up in the clouds and we'll never be able to understand that. Everybody comes back and thinks, well, he takes what the current situation is and dilutes it to a level that we, the normal people, quite understand it and can talk about it and do all that stuff. No, it's true. But the reality of it is, at no point have you said, in quarter 2 of 2023, the market's going to lift 23.2%, and then in quarter 3, it's going to drop 17.4%. Every single thing you say is caveated by, I hope this is right, I think this is right, and it's probably a better spinner than most people can put on it. But the reality is, it's not enough to be starting a business. It would be time, I think, just now for education. I think it's time to start learning new things. If you're not as busy in your current job, if you're not as busy in your current property portfolio, and I think a lot of people that we're talking to are finding it hard to get stock or hard to get deals or hard to do things. So maybe it's time to, if you're thinking you might want to add a side skill, I think a lot of people get into property as a side skill that probably are thinking now, well, maybe it's not going to make enough cash flow, or I have to do things I don't want to do to make cash flow. Learning other things, crypto's a thing that I'm probably starting to learn a wee bit about just now and trying to work out whether that, as somebody who has no crypto, doesn't have a wallet, doesn't do anything, but you can see other people making money and doing things and think, well, maybe that's something you could do, but now's the time to be learning about it as opposed to jumping in. Sorry if that's not a kind of...
I think that's absolutely brilliant. That's all I would have wanted and more, I think, coming from that. So I would say there's 2 things in there that are really, really sensible for people to take away. Number one, you're seeing the requirement for a higher risk premium at the moment. That's effectively what you're saying, and that is the way that a lot of investment money will be thinking at the moment. I would not underestimate that. So that means people want higher returns on equity for taking risk. Now, that has been the direction of travel for the past sort of 10 or 15 years or so, and I think Helen and I have spoken a number of times about people not understanding the risks that they're taking. And the problem, or one of the problems that comes off the back of this, is when people have already been taking more risk, because let's just say the bond, at a simple level, the bond market has been trashed since 2009 in terms of where you were all right if you were holding them beforehand, because the value of those bonds went up massively, And they've still continued to go up because the long-term interest rates have gone down. But we've kind of hit this natural bottom here that everybody feels on the back of a sort of 30, 40-year bond market. And what happened was a lot of the money in the world that was in equity, the old splits might have been 60-40 in favour of bonds for some people and 40% equity. And that's kind of migrated over to more like 70 or 80% equity in the past 12 or 13 years. So A, not much further for it to go because they've kind of gone to the well there on that one. And B, if the risk premium then goes up, what happens? Well, volatility goes up. Things move more quickly. The growth, someone asked me this morning, what do you do if your pension's in stocks? Which is a great question. And my answer was something like, look, being out of equities is dangerous, but you might want to consider rotating some of that into some value stocks, i.e. stocks that are paying dividends in the now. And some other stuff about what you said, Ross, I think is that we live in a space when it comes to solely property, we trade or hold or invest in an asset that is a staple good. And that's a good thing. Food businesses, shelter businesses, the oldest profession in the world. I won't lower the tone. I'll give Jay the chance to do that later. But the bottom levels of the pyramid, right? These are the times where it pays to be involved in those industries because people are always going to need that shelter. Grocery, for example, has done incredibly well in the last 2 years because what held up brilliantly during the pandemic? Supermarkets did incredibly well. The yields demanded on supermarkets have gone down and down and down. What's the reality of their business model? Well, they're under massive pressure at the moment, massive inflationary pressures. They were under massive pressures in 2020 because they suddenly had all this extra demand because I think we've said it before, but only 60% of the food in the UK in the end of 2019 was being bought from supermarkets. The other 40% was therefore restaurants, takeaways, wholesalers, all that sort of stuff, which obviously when restaurants were closed went right down through the floor. So that then meant, okay, on a simple level, more business for supermarkets. But what it really went was desperate need for more delivery drivers, desperate need for more staff, desperate need to get stock in on the shelves. These are not profitable activities. Business like steady state, right? It doesn't like things going mad and changing left, right and centre. And if you look at the results of the supermarkets, they actually bear that out. Revenues massively swollen, but profit margins eroded. And then they're now dealing with all their suppliers coming to them and saying, look, the chicken costs 12% more. It's as simple as that. The price has got to go up 12%. And they're thinking, well, the consumers can't stand a 12% price. So you need to swallow some of that, and we'll need to swallow some of that. And these are razor thin margins in the first place. So there's significant difficulties there. So I wouldn't expect anything to be particularly easy at the moment. But on the flip side, we are seeing new rents on properties go up gigantically. We're putting stuff out at 800 quid that was 550 quid, 600 quid, and it's getting hoovered up in 30 inquiries overnight because the stock is stopping it being there. Now, you could say, well, there's no point doing that if the people you put in can't afford it. But unfortunately for everybody else, in reality, of the 30 or 40 applicants we get hammered with, 3 or 4 can afford it reasonably well and are taking it probably as a bit of a stopgap measure, probably waiting for things to calm down a bit. But I had a chat with someone this week who was talking to their local estate agent who was saying, right, it's time to sell. Everything's selling so well, go into rented and then wait for the crash. And it reminded me of something you said then, Ross, very much so. 2001, there was this famous article in The Economist which did this beautiful analysis saying UK property is 28.3% overvalued. And so therefore what you should do is you should sell, you should go into rental and wait for the crash. 2001 to 2007, the market went up something like 180% or something like that. And then it went down 15%. So not only did you pay 7 years rent waiting for the crash, you also missed out on a doubling in value at a time when inflation was relatively low. So a massive real terms gain. So go back to the point about gold. Right, gold was starting from a high base when we went into the last 2 years worth of complete and utter volatility and all the rest of it. House prices weren't necessarily. And I would, for once, I would say you can pretty much include London and not London in the same conversation here. London hit its peak very late 15, early 16, depending on where you're looking at. Mayfair, it was more like 2014. Other parts, it was more like 2017, 2018. But London as a group did that. In 2010, between 2010 and 2020, prices actually went down in real terms across 58% of the UK, right? Now, what does that mean? So that's not taking that. Remember, I'm not cherry picking the date there. I'm just doing it by decade. So I haven't picked the date at 2007, which some people do to say, well, the market has been up there. Well, it has, but it crashed. It was unsustainable, right? I'm picking 2010 after or in the late part of a correction. Houses became more affordable in real terms, considering taking inflation into account. Now, the problem that a lot of people had is their wages didn't go up in real terms because of austerity. So that also has to be taken into account. But in the private sector, they didn't do too badly. So when we went into the pandemic, we were not starting from a high base of suddenly screaming capital growth. And everyone's forgetting that while all these things are going on, houses are up 12 or 13% year on year. Well, we were doing okay buying some. There wasn't a lot of stock, but we were doing okay buying stuff in January, February 2021 while there was a lockdown because people still weren't particularly bullish. So we've had 12 months at 1% a month, let's call it, for the sake of it being relatively easy. That's not panic stations territory just yet. If you then throw in inflation approaching double digits and persisting, my feeling is now we're going to be persisting at about 5% for some years. I mean, 2 to 3 years, maybe slightly longer. And that probably will see a regime change at the Bank of England at the first port of call. But I feel a bit for the governor because I don't know that there's anything he particularly could have done about it. Then you haven't got this kind of crazy bubble that people would necessarily be worrying about. You haven't necessarily got unsustainable things. You haven't necessarily got growth in real terms. And you've got to pay serious attention to all the moving parts. So what have you got to pay attention to as a trader? Well, there's always a danger as a trader of seeing things selling incredibly well and therefore you then overpaying. And that's where you might be able to potentially get caught. You also got the fact that, you know, your stock levels are not where you'd like them to be for a property trading business to be there. So it's very, very difficult to control that. Throwing more money at the problem doesn't necessarily solve it.
I would say some traders also look just at trading as the only exit, and they don't look at what would happen if they can't trade the property for 3 months and how much it would cost them.
Yeah, so holding costs are a big. I mean, you know, we both see, I'm sure, Piotr, we see traders lose money all the time. They're not losing money on the 50 houses a month that they're trading, but there are 5 or 10 stinkers in there that they do potentially lose money on. They see it as a passport into the auction to see if one goes crazy or whatever. And of course, overall, they make money. Of course they do. And it's easy to pick one and say, that didn't make much sense, you know, when you've done a deep analysis on it and they've done it in 10 minutes or whatever. But same goes for holders. They need to be looking at ultimately what can they do to keep their bills down, for their tenants or for themselves if they're paying in HMO or SA, things like that. That's a big factor at the moment. You don't need to wait for these huge bills to roll in. You need to be doing something about it today, realistically. Budget, cost control. It doesn't feel like a particularly good time to be aggressive, or as Ross said, you can look at things that it's a good time to get things across the desk and look at them and see if they work. But unless they're better than average, it might not be time to be getting involved in them. So the flip side of that is the mentality of, and I'm like Ross, I hate sitting on my hands. You know, I'm terrible when I'm bored. Not very good at it at all. But it's time to be fairly philosophical about worst case scenarios and how they could play out. And the flip side can be, it's a great time to be taking some debt. It's a fantastic time to be taking some fixed rate debt. It really, really is. So people who are buying stuff and fixing on 5-year fixes now today could look back in 4 or 5 years' time and be in a really, really good position. Even though in real terms the property hasn't made money, the leverage has done a fantastic thing for them. So, Helen, you're going to say something about that?
Oh yeah, no, just thinking the rates you can borrow at, and I kind of think that the main thing, or one of the main things, and it's just a number, but it really is a number to keep in people's head from your article this morning, is the 7.5% plus projection for inflation. And think about what that really means. You know, if your money in the bank is earning 0.000%, and that wasn't great when you had inflation at 3%, think about that now when we're heading to 7.5%. Or, I mean, realistically, if we're heading there, we're heading for double figures, right? And some people would say that real inflation, i.e. not the official figure, but actually real inflation that we feel in our pockets, is in double figures already. But something else that you said that really resonated with me is about risk premia. So I've definitely been sat on my hands for a long while now. I've literally did my first deal last week. Someone that came on the Landlord Investor Show, and that's my first deal. It's taken until March to do that. But I did that because I managed to negotiate a really good kind of deal in it for me. We managed to de-risk it as part of by asking more questions, getting them to put more money in. They would have more skin in the game, makes me in a much happier position, right? And then also managed to up the return that I was getting on it. So that money's working so much harder, and that's what I need it to be doing than ever before, particularly in this environment. And just to touch on something else, I find it funny, and it's true, but it's funny that, you know, when we're talking about gold and crypto and things moving into that as a flight to safety, that the fact that we're even mentioning crypto in a flight to safety, you know, it's long term it might prove to be safety, and as everybody I think knows, like I'm in it, so I'm totally there. But also, as Ross said, like if you're gonna start dipping your toes in it, and I would do the toe dip, educate yourself, really educate yourself. And I don't mean like with YouTube videos, and I don't mean people who pop up on Instagram going, we're gonna make you zillionaires in 2 weeks. No, like find somebody that's in it, that's doing it. Find the credible people to follow, and definitely do it that way and start small. So yeah, that's my 2 pence.
What's the kind of deal you did, Helen?
It's a really small. It's one in London, actually, close to where I am. So I'm in Lambeth. It's around here. It's with somebody based kind of around here, and it's a glorified flip with a bit of extra work. It's in probate at the moment, so not expecting anything to move terribly quickly on that. But fortunately, my patience has grown over the past 2 years, so so hopefully we can just eke that one out. But yeah, no, it's a little flip, but it's the first time I've done a deal with this person. So all my usual caveats and ways of doing things apply. Start small, try this out, see how it goes, and if that works well, then kind of scale up from there. So
nice one.
Yeah.
Makes lots of sense. I think makes lots of sense. So I think we've covered sort of most of what I've been trying to get across in what I've said today. I think the thing that people can be left with, I guess, a little bit is what the hell are we supposed to do about it, to an extent which I understand, and maybe even what if you ask the tough questions, like if you were the governor of the Bank of England or on the committee or whatever, what would you do? Well, there is a bit of maybe the Milton Friedman style approach here is let the market rip, which I'm not saying I necessarily agree with, but there is the phrase that says the best cure for high prices is high prices. And those who strongly believe in the power of the market, and I mean, I do very strongly believe in the power of the market, I just have some concerns around the boundaries when you let it rip and it's unfettered, that there are externalities that can affect 99% of us and benefit 1% of us, which doesn't really help anybody. But what that effectively means is people can't afford stuff anymore, and therefore they don't get stuff. So rents for me are in a really interesting position. So just say one thing I wanted to say on the back of what Helen said. Interestingly, I do think London could be quite well placed phenomenal capital value rises over the last few years if you piece together some of the stuff that we've said today, because some of those prices haven't done that much particularly exciting for about 6 years now, in a time of inflation, in a time where, and I haven't seen the data on this, but I've read reports that are saying, you know, if you think about the financial centre driving a lot of the big income earning in London, people are having to be incentivized with more money in order to go back to the office. And most of the finance companies want everybody back in the office, so they're willing to pay a bit more in order to achieve that. And then in times of inflation, a lot of these guys and girls are going to be the ones that understand this most, so they'll be using it as a lever to negotiate their salaries upwards and things like that. What does that mean? More affordability, house prices go upwards, etc., etc. So that's an interesting point that I think comes off the back of that. And I think London is well placed and hasn't had that base effect causing a problem because the last few years have been so sluggish. And if inflation and wage rises come along with it, then there's an interesting potential outcome there. But you go back to the best cure for high prices is high prices. Well, if people can't afford stuff, demand goes down. So where the problems that we've had in the past couple of years have been to do with a two-pronged attack that we've talked about before. You've ultimately got problems with supply of stuff. So the Suez Canal caused a specific issue. People just cancelling, people in Q2 2020 thinking that global demand was going to go off a cliff, causing commodity providers, manufacturers, producers, etc., to lower production for the next quarter, half year, etc., which then completely span on its head. And there was a massive surge in demand for goods. Demand for services was down, demand for goods was up. So that double bubble caused that problem. Now, if that forces prices up and up and up through the roof, then ultimately that can go right back on its head. And some of this stuff could change relatively quickly. And suddenly you could have a bigger supply of commodities and not so much demand for the goods at the end of it, and it could spin back. One of the other things that I think is interesting is that the Bank of England is forecasting higher unemployment if we follow this path, which would be natural because you slow the economy down, the economy is struggling anyway. The real base rate of growth in our economy is 1 to 1.5%, maybe 2%. It has been for, since, 2010. Arguably, realistically, and since QE was implemented as a policy. So forget about what happened last quarter and what happened last year and stuff like that because of the base effects that we talked about. So that's the real base level. Well, it doesn't take an awful lot to push that down into 0.5%, 0% recession. We're looking at the bank will be modelling. I'm pretty confident when their report comes out in 6 weeks' time, they'll be modelling a 50% chance or so of a recession within the next 3 years. Now, that's only a 50% chance. And the government with more skillful fiscal policy, and I did say in this week's supplement, I think the fiscal policy has been superb. Generally, the odd exception, but I think it's been superb the last couple of years. The trouble is, how do they keep it up? And how does it not feed further into inflation if what they need to do is more direct stimulus? And that's a specific problem. If you don't think bounce back loans or furlough or a number of the other schemes had a direct impact on the inflation we're seeing now, I'm afraid that you are kidding yourself. It definitely had an impact on some of the house price transactions that have gone on, just anecdotally from talking to people. Providing liquidity into a market like that is going to provide, even if that liquidity shouldn't necessarily have made it into that market, providing liquidity into a market like that is going to provide stimulus and then provide drag if you're then going to pay it back, which everybody apart from Paul Smith does, obviously.
Oh, wow. And put the gloves back on. It's still early.
Just checking if you were awake, Jake. That was all.
That was a really good point, though, in the supplement, though, about that percent increase in the unemployment rate is a 25% difference to where we are now. And when you look at it like that, it's huge, right?
Well, that and also, I didn't actually put this in, but I did think about it as I was rereading it. you know, the Great Resignation, as we're calling it in our loquacious English way. The Americans call it the Big Quit because they prefer shorter, punchier stuff. We've lost 500,000 people from the labour market in the UK. So that would be people of ages 16 or over, but generally 18 or over, who are not participating in the labour market out of choice. Right. So we can theorise, and not just theorise, I think we'll all know some people like this who were relatively deeper in their careers and were working all the hours that God sent and decided, you know what, I've had enough of this. I don't know why I'm working. The pandemic's made me think again and made me think, actually, I want a different life. I don't need the money. I've paid my house off. I've done this. I've done that. I'm going to do some volunteering, or I'm going to take a part-time role rather than a full-time one. So 500,000 people left the labour market, right? That's more than 25% of the unemployed, right? Now, the best cure for high prices is high prices. So maybe some of those people get forced back into the labour market because their initial forecast of, well, I'm sitting on 30 grand a year, not linked to inflation wages, and I'm in my late 50s and I can sharpen the pencil a bit and whatever, now looks like I might struggle to put petrol in the car and get enough food for the family. And there's definitely not enough left for a couple of holidays and, you know, stuff for the grandchildren or whatever else might be on the agenda. So that could shoehorn a few people back into the labour market, interesting enough. And of course, they might be attracted in. We've just hit the point where, for the first time since records began, we've got one vacancy for every one unemployed person who is seeking work. 1-for-1 ratio. I mean, that's utterly incredible. It doesn't, you know, there are structural and frictional reasons why they won't all match up and get a job, and skills gaps and all the rest of those things. But still, theoretically, full employment is on the card. So, you know, even the Keynesians and the monetarists and the modern monetary theorists and all the rest of it would probably agree it's not a bad time to be tightening on that front, but there's going to be pain involved. And one of my arguments today was, people look at the way things are going rather than you don't sit down with your individual, or even I don't do this, right? Sit down with your individual household balance sheet and say, well, my net worth is up or down by X or Y, my income is up or down by X or Y, and then adjusted for inflation in real terms, I'm 1.4% worse off than last year, right? What we go by feel, we go by.
I don't believe you, Adam. I don't believe you.
Yeah, I call bullshit. I call bullshit on
nonsense.
that. That's a quarterly review at the Lawrence household, guaranteed. That's quarterly.
Look, his daughter
can see-
KPIs.
I can see you
gets
and
his
Rod
daughter
sat
to do
there.
that for.
All right, everyone apart from us. Fine. Outed live on camera. No, but what we do is we go on how a lot of our lives we live on heuristics, right? We live on our gut feel, and ultimately the direction of travel is arguably more. It's a kind of almost a perception is reality argument, which I used last week, but we go by the way things are going, and we strive towards things. There's so much. You could tax the billionaires, let's say, by an extra 20% on their income, let's say, right? And a lot of people who aren't billionaires but are very wealthy would get quite upset at that. Now, a lot of those people will never be billionaires, right? But if you take their aspirations away, it will hurt them. So if things are going in the right direction, it's that feel-good factor that they, I think it was coined in the 90s around election time, wasn't it? Can they get the feel-good factor back? It's a big deal. It's almost more of a big deal than if base rate is 0.75 or inflation is 7.1 or unemployment is 4.1 or whatever. Which way is it going, and which way does it look like it's going? This government will have built up a significant amount of goodwill in the way that they've managed the public finances in the last 2 years. Now, some people might laugh at that because 37 billion on track and trace and whatever. But I strongly believe that to be the case. And I also strongly believe a lot of people will think, well, if the other guy had won in 2019, I'm not sure we would have been so good on the public purse front, right? Now, I make that statement today. It's the 20th of March, 2022. We're a couple of years, with 27 months away from an election, something like that, roughly, right? So memories can slide away. We've got a couple of years of having gone through the pandemic. We've got a couple of years of remembering just how rubbish it was. You know, we're coming up to the second anniversary of the first lockdown. I'm not sure how we're celebrating it, whether it's lighters in the air or not going out for a week or going out for a big street party or whatever. But we will remember that for a while. But that will have started to ebb away by the time we get to the election. And if people are facing, you know, the headlines in the Mirror say unemployment's up by this is going on, that's going, nurse can't afford to fill her car up to get to work, etc., then there will be a really significant chance of a political swing. And in many ways, that's some of the more concerning things that could go on, given that some of the policies that the left, not picking on the Labour Party, but the left in some parts of the world these days enact policies that are significant value destruction policies. And that's a problem when you've got an economy that's already wobbling. And that is where you could get towards if Michael Foot got elected, you could have a 1970s style situation. Look at it that way. Hopeful that we won't, of course.
I think a point on that, Adam, which is a brilliant point as always, is I don't see, even if there is that swing in the next 2 and a bit years, I don't think we're going to be out of it in 2 to 3 years. I don't think we're going to be out of it in 4 to 5 years. And I think what has happened historically is whenever the public purse has got itself into some deep doo-doo, they normally bring the Conservatives or the right in to kind of act as the no, you put your pocket money into this saving account, you put your this, to really kind of nurse it back to health, because the left are known for to a certain extent some arbitrary red taping and some additional this and that, and they've never really handled the purse well. It's normally because they've handled the purse poorly that the Conservatives or the right, however they are seen, kind of enters into the fray. But I think after reading your article, it looks like it could be a real 50-50.
Yeah, that's a really good point, though, Jake. Because you think about the biggest deals in the last 100 years or so, Second World War, for example. What happens when you're in the depths of the war? You stick with the incumbents. What happens when you're out the back of it and busy patting yourself on the back? Then they vote for the other team because they can blame you for everything that went wrong. So that is true, and we could well be in that fog of war. If you think we haven't sorted all of the problems from the financial crisis in 13 years, or even if you said 11 years, because 2020, it's not really fair to expect too much to have been sorted out in 2020 or beyond. This is another event of significant magnitude that's gone a different way, that adds another 10 years to that equation. I think in 2020, I said, look, I can't see the base rate going over 2.5% for the next 10 years, right? Now, I think what I really probably should have said is I don't think the base rate should go over 2.5% for the next 10 years. But you forget, when you're in a devil in a deep blue sea situation for the central bank, something's got to give here. So what will give first? Will they ratchet until they break something? There's a classic critique, especially of the Federal Reserve. They love to say it in the States, the Fed goes until it breaks something. That's the way they always look at it. But they all detest the central bank because really they just want, an utter free market to be able to make as much money as they can. And they don't agree with people tinkering and setting rates and doing all the stuff that they do, the dot plots and all the rest of it, although it's good fun analysing what they say, and their direction of travel is often indicative of what happens in the UK. But yeah, we could still be. I don't think that's much of a pep talk for the Conservative Party at number 10, is it really? Well, let's hope we're still in enough trouble that we get elected in 2024. So I think this is an important budget we've got next week. Rishi's going to have to start thinking about setting things up in order to prepare for a tax cut next year. There's no two ways about it. And this is why one of the reasons why the tax rises will still carry on. Another reason why they should is because they're another good way to curb inflation. I'm talking not from a pocket point of view here, because everyone's getting hurt by it, but also those who are on higher salaries are going to contribute more to social care in a proportionate way. Not all taxes in the UK are structured in that way, so that has to be seen as a positive thing. You've actually got a Conservative administration here who are willing to be reasonably redistributive. Having said that, if they put capital gains tax up, I'm throwing everything out the window and moving to Portugal.
Yay.
Interesting one, Adam, because you mentioned Rishi, and he's probably one of the few in the UK government that, aside from being a politician, is actually fairly competent at their craft. And I think that's encouraging insofar as he's done some, in the main, some fairly intelligent bits and pieces. You know, he's not perfect, no one is, but I think his positives far and away outweigh the blunders or the missteps or miscalculations. So even as a betting man, you've got to be somewhat confident that you know, if he and the bods at the Bank of England have had a solid chat, that they've got a way forward where if these inflationary measures are going to come in, how do they stagger it in a way that doesn't kind of jolt the market off of its pedestal?
Yeah, and I think you probably have touched on there one of my other thoughts at the moment around the political side, in that the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Shadow Chancellor are probably more important as political figures than they've been for some years, realistically, and may well form quite a large. If you were Rishi, I'm not suggesting there's a Blair Brown deal going on with Boris, because Boris is on too rocky a ground to be doing any deals with anybody. But if you thought that Boris was the best winner of the next election, and Rishi might well be best off in that position as Chancellor because of that credibility, if what you said about us still being relatively deep in the financial mire is still the case. So I think Labour would probably have to shake up their team. I don't think Rachel Reeves is bad at all, actually. I think compared to Annalise Dodds, she's night and day, far, far better. But I don't know that the voting populace will take the time to read too much or listen to too much from Rachel Reeves in order to give Labour even a crack of the whip. So the worse they do now, the better off they are in 2024. That's what you're saying. That's not ideal for us, is it, really?
It's not ideal, but it's as a betting man, which I'm not solidly. It's the one I'd put a shekel behind, I think.
Shekel.
It's definitely credible. It's definitely credible.
Yeah, we don't do less than £20 bets.
Oh,
I
okay.
do no more than 50 pence. 50 pence is my maximum. I haven't got the inaugural insurance desk trophy that John Cox prepared for me for predicting the interest rate yet, but I should have it on my shoulder quite proudly. It's a nice thing. Pride of place at the office. Pride of place.
Nice one.
I sat up at the front of every Partners in Property event, you know, right at the very front. People, well, what's that trophy for?
Cool. Okay. Well, I think it's been a masterclass in economy, inflation, predictions, and how to predict without predicting.
That's the skill, isn't it? Ultimately, I've got quite a few predictions out there on the line at the moment, and when I did, when Helen and Ruth kindly invited me back on to do another prediction for 2022 on the Property Sisters YouTube, it was very good because Ruth held me to account for what I'd said the year before, which of course I'd completely forgotten, and she could have made it all up and made me look really bad. But actually, she was very kind, and she made me look quite good because she made a big deal of the stuff I got right and kind of swept the stuff I got wrong under the carpet. So thanks for that, Ruth. I owe you one. I appreciate that. But yeah, you've got to have a position to take. I think the hardest thing is ultimately getting your head around another thing that I've been saying for a couple of years. Unfortunately, it's going to be quite a hard time to make long-term money at this point if you're looking at inflation-adjusted returns. What really you need to be looking at is, if you're lucky enough to have assets and deploy assets, can you do better than the average realistically. So if it is a tough 10 years to create value and you can beat that, I'll give you an example. When I worked in wealth management, building portfolios in Switzerland, I left that job in 2006. And in 2008-9, my portfolios lost 6% that I created. Now, that's a spectacular result. Not if you go around worrying about whether you're making money or not, but if you only lost 6%, what it meant is you had a very well diversified and hedged exposure. And we're talking, tens of millions of pounds per investor, largely speaking, in that environment. So you're never going to win any awards for losing 6%, right? But that's much better than making 10%. Or I remember saying a little while ago on here, when someone came out and said, I've made 54% on Bitcoin this year, and miserable old me chipped in and said, yeah, the Bitcoin's at 538%. So what you've been playing at? I mean, it's rubbish. It's rubbish. You could have just bought it and sat on it for a week. And people don't necessarily think like that, unfortunately. And, ultimately you're in this. If you think about the game, it's about alpha and beta, whether it's about finance, whether it's about property, whether it's about investing in. What does Helen want to do? She wants to invest in people who are a safer covenant than on the face of it, and her due diligence reveals they're a good bet. And therefore, she's getting a good, fair return on her money that's over and above what she would get if she gave it to XYZ property or whatever, who could lend it out on first charge and she wouldn't need to do anything. That's Helen's alpha. Right? What are we doing when we get involved in a property trade? We're not looking to buy in so we can get exposure to the market. We want that market to carry us forward. Of course we do. But we want our entry point to be skillful, and we want our optimization to be skillful. And that's our alpha, right? That's where we're adding our value. And the reality is we can still do all of that. We're still going to go and do all of that. The opportunities might look a bit different. And in 10 years' time, when the Lawrence household sits down to review its balance sheet quarterly or whatever and check out its KPIs, it might be that we haven't done all that well, but it might be that we've managed to keep our heads fairly above water compared to what the market returns would have offered, and we've also gained a reasonable amount of alpha based on the time, effort, and risk that we've taken. And that is all we can hope to do. And that's my epitaph for this week. That's going to be on the headstone. That's it. It's a bit long for the headstone. But.
Something as well that I think is worth saying, as we have touched on crypto as well, and actually I'm saying it because I did it myself this week. Something popped up, it's an altcoin, popped up like 30%. I took some profit, and that's when, we're going back, we've talked about education already. There's not just kind of learning about the market and crypto and what they're about and the market cap, et cetera, et cetera. There's also like the skill of what you're doing. And that's what you're talking when you're talking about alpha there. Like this thing popped up 30% and I'm like literally in out, and I got my capital out. So all I've now got at risk, all I'm playing with on that coin is profit. It's not even like my money. It's free money now. It's a all money out deal, like on a crypto, right? But people miss that because they're like, oh, well, it could have gone up 200%. I don't care. It's gone up 30% in a day. Thank you. That's my exit. And the rest is free money now. So it's thinking about investment. And it doesn't have to be crypto. That you could be playing around with gold or silver or whatever you want to play with. Nickel. God, I wish I'd been on nickel over the past month.
You'd have made more than a nickel out of it. That's for sure. You're making some dimes. You're making some dimes.
Exactly, but work out like your skill and where you can get that alpha. It's a bigger, broader education than just the asset per se.
I totally agree, and I think it comes back to something that Ross said earlier in terms of you're not necessarily going to get something at the bottom. None of it. We're not trying to time bottoms and tops in things. Ultimately, we're trying to make sure we're going in the right direction and we're fundamentally doing a good job doing what we're doing. And what you just said, people. Why do things like pound cost averaging work so well for people, Helen, normally speaking? Why do people like Warren Buffett say, do dollar cost averaging, sit on your hands? Because we all have this tendency without experience and governance and emotional control to buy high and sell low. So unless we can engineer that out of our system, we shouldn't be trading crypto. We shouldn't be buying stocks. We shouldn't be doing any of those things, right? So these are the fundamental basics of money management, bankroll management, and emotional management that ultimately enable you to be a crypto or NFT trader, a property trader, a property investor, a stock trader, a professional poker player. The skill set's exactly the same.
Yeah.
Exactly the same. It's what you want to apply it to, and that's why you see people who are multidisciplinary skilled in that world quite often.
You also kind of rely a little bit on heuristics there as well, right? Because that's the fluid that enables you to kind of move across those disciplines smoothly without creating too much friction.
Absolutely, and you don't need 58,000 spreadsheets at every point in order to make a decision. I understand why people might think that I do act like that, but I don't. In real terms, I don't, because I've got enough of that information, generally speaking, and enough on the high level numbers to be able to say, do you know what, we need to get on with this and do something now. Let's do it.
Yeah.
So back to the conversation that Ross was referring to that we were having earlier, a salty one at like 6 a.m. on WhatsApp or whatever between three of us. There's some good concepts in there, but ultimately we're not sitting down and going, well, actually, I think Scotland might go up 7.14% next year. So are you sure it's a good idea to do this or that? It's not how we're thinking. We're thinking, right, where's the alpha? Where's the beta? Do we want the beta? Not necessarily. Have we done most of the alpha? Yes, we have. Right, okay. Then maybe we need to consider liquidation and redeployment, which is a problem in itself, of course, but one for another day.
Nice one. Well, as I can see from some comments, Adam, you've earned new fans. We're listening to you at the gym. So when is that next book coming, Adam?
Got to do the first one first, Piotr. That's the thing. But I'm still too scared of the book launch after the last one. So
We'll be there to support you. Don't worry.
Okay.
yeah, it was the support that was the problem last time. But anyway, we digress.
One would argue it was the lack of support that caused most of the problems last time.
Touche.
Not from me. I carried him down the stairs.
Amazing, cool, great chat, great conversation about all this stuff that we need to be aware of, and we're back next week, right?
That's right.
Absolutely.
Okay, amazing. Thanks everyone for listening and putting your comments in. We had quite a few comments today from different channels, so it's good to see the engagement, and speak to you guys all next week.
Thanks, guys.